Good afternoon, everybody. No mai, hoki mai, to what is indeed the last witnesses that this Royal Commission will hear. Some might say we've left the best to last, but it's an important part of our process that this is indeed the last time that we will be hearing publicly from witnesses. So, Ms. Guy Kidd.
Tēnā koutou katoa, talofa lava. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Good afternoon, survivors and members of the public. My name is Fiona Guy Kidd, and together with Jeremy Johnson and India Shores, we act for the Anglican Church, Anglican care and service organisations, and most schools affiliated with the Anglican Church. I am a 53-year-old Pākehā woman, 5'7", with blonde hair, and I'm wearing a teal blue dress. The three witnesses you are going to hear from today are all from the Anglican Core Church. The first is Bishop Ross Bay. He is the current Bishop of Auckland, and he is to the right here. Auckland is one of the 7 dioceses which comprise Tikanga Pākehā. We understand that he has been called and asked to give evidence primarily relating to Dilworth School, which, as you've heard, is an independent school in Auckland created by the will of James Dilworth, who was an Anglican. Dilworth School was not founded by the Anglican Church, and unlike some of the other schools you've heard from, such as Wellesley and some of the Catholic schools, it has never been owned by or governed by the Anglican Church. St Peter's in Cambridge is another example of a school in that situation. The Royal Commission has also asked to hear again from the 2 primates, the 2 leaders of the Anglican Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Archbishop Don Tamihere in the middle, who heads Tikanga Māori, and who is also the Bishop for Tairāwhiti, and Archbishop Philip Richardson to the left, who heads Tikanga Pākehā, and who is also the Bishop for Taranaki and Waikato. We've actually got the 3 of them together now, but as you will recall, the 2 of them giving their evidence, 2 primates reflecting their equal and joint roles. In the last 18 months since you heard from our witnesses and since the first institutional hearing, the archbishops have been personally engaged in redress processes and personal meetings with survivors of abuse in the church. Bishops throughout New Zealand have also been engaged in redress processes with survivors. The archbishops and bishops have used their influence to support survivors and to promote that survivors' voices and input are central to the design of redress processes. And we have done that in interactions with the state, with schools, and with the church itself. Both archbishops have used their many opportunities when speaking publicly, in churches, in the media, to talk about abuse within the church, and responses. What they are trying to do and effect is cultural change. The development of a more formalised, in some aspects, church redress system based on Māori principles, such as Mataranga and Kaiatitanga, is also currently underway, and there's a lot of thought going into that. The church sees that many of these principles are not limited to redress and can also be applied to other aspects in the church, such as the selection of priests. The 3 tikanga streams, with the equal decision-making power of each, is one of the significant ways in which the church lives the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, including tino rangatiratanga. further changes to the Title D disciplinary process that you may recall we discussed are underway and are being considered by General Synod next week. And those clarify the extent of its coverage and enlarge its scope. And they've been proposed and they're going to be considered by that meeting next week. And those changes arise out of the learnings regarding the operation of Title D as experienced by survivors in the last 18 months. And we're very grateful to the continuing input of the survivors that we have worked with and heard from. So I will now hand over to each of the gentlemen here to describe themselves. We'll start with that.
Shall I just give them the affirmation and then...
Yes, let's do that first.
Then we can speak freely after that. Good afternoon to each of you, and thank you again for returning. And I'm just going to ask you to take the affirmation. Do you all, each of you, solemnly and sincerely, truly declare and affirm that the evidence you'll give today will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do. I do. I do.
Tēnā koutou. Thank you, Mr. Aiken.
And if I could ask you for a personal description of yourself.
This is the most challenging part of the evidence, I can tell you right now, for all of us.
Well, tēnā koutou katoa. I am Ross Bay, the Anglican Bishop of Auckland. I'm a 57-year-old male of medium height and build. I have short, light brown hair. I'm clean-shaven, and today I'm wearing a blue suit and shirt with a red tie. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou. Philip Richardson. I'm a 64-year-old overweight white male with dark greying hair, wearing a dark suit and what one of my colleagues described as an indescribable tie, and a white shirt. I'm not clean-shaven, I have a beard.
Tēnā hoki koutou. My name is Don Tamihere. I'm the Bishop of Tairāwhiti, Bishop of Aotearoa, and one of the Archbishops and Primates of the Anglican Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. I'm a typically substantial Māori male, 49 years old, 5'11" and 3/4, wearing a blue suit that doesn't signify the way I vote, and I have a gold tie on today. Kia ora tātou.
Right, Bishop, I'll hand over to you, Archbishop Tamihere.
Tāpiri atu I tērā, he mea tika kia tuku atu, he tino mihi rau atu kia koutou e te tēpu koutou ngā kai ko mihana kia koe e te hea. Nei rā mātou e tuahu nei kia koutou I runga te aroha, me te mihi atu kia koutou I runga te tapu te mana hoki o tō koutou mahi. Me te whakaro nui ki te hunga kua te paina I nāia nei a ngā purapura ora, ngā mōrehu, ngā mea kua pāngia e te tūkinotanga. Nei rā te mihi ki a rātou katoa ki runga I te aroha. Kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koe. Tekena kia mihi kia koutou. Muri o mai o koutou mana, o koutou reo, o koutou tikanga ki wanganui a mātou. Nā reira nau mai hara mai. Tēnā koe.
We'll start. I'll ask some questions around with Ross Bay. And Ross, you have a statement that you've prepared. I'll get you to read that, and then I will ask some further questions arising from the evidence the commissioners have heard today. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish to begin by reiterating the apology I made in my previous evidence to all survivors of abuse while in the care of the Anglican Church or one of our related institutions. You did not receive the genuine care to which you were entitled. This failure has been compounded by our lack of responsiveness over the years to people who came forward to report abuse and to seek redress. I apologise for that, and I reiterate the Church's commitment to enter into processes of redress with survivors in good faith. Especially today, I wish to acknowledge and apologise to those who are the survivors of abuse at Dilworth School. This is a school that was meant to offer hope and stability for boys coming from vulnerable situations. Instead, advantage was taken of that vulnerability by various members of the staff. Among those who abused students were 2 Anglican chaplains. The Church recognises its responsibility for these people who were the Church's direct representatives on the staff. You should have been able to expect that they, more than others, would be role models for genuine care and compassion. I apologise deeply for their actions and acknowledge the shame which the Church bears as a result. I wish to comment on my and the Church's relationship with the school. As you know, the will of James Dilworth requires that boys attending the school receive education in the teaching of the Anglican faith. It also appoints the Bishop of Auckland as the episcopal visitor to the school and invites the bishop to visit the school at any time and to enter any comments or observations in the book reserved for this purpose. Early on, when the church was small, those visits would probably have been more frequent, with comments on the detail of school operations and programs. Over time, as the school grew in size and complexity, the visit has become an annual event with a program established for the bishop to get a general sense of the fabric, programs and morale of the school across its now 3 campuses, and to be assured of the maintenance of Anglican character. The school is owned and governed by its independent trust board. The Anglican Church does not appoint any trustees. The Bishop of Auckland cannot be a trustee. This presents a challenge as to how to effectively keep abreast of a school that carries the Anglican name and the limits of an annual visit to achieve that. Although the responsibility for the safety of the school environment rests primarily with trustees and school management, the Church acknowledges its moral responsibility for this, and especially for the work of the chaplains. I have given this issue particular thought over the last couple of years in the wake of the arrest and conviction of Ross Brown for offences of sexual abuse. A key issue is ensuring that the right people are recruited for these roles. The appointment of a chaplain must be undertaken in a far more collaborative way to ensure that neither party is simply recommending an appointment to the other based on their belief that it would be good. There must be effective due diligence based on the information that both parties have to bring to the process of search and appointment. Related to recruitment for specific roles, the Church also needs to ensure that its discernment processes in selecting people for ordination itself are robust, consistent, and minimise the risk of possible offenders being ordained. It is essential that there is better communication between the Church and school about any matters that relate to the safety of students and particularly when a chaplain is involved. A commitment from both parties to such communication and taking appropriate action as a result must characterise the relationship moving forward. Further, the changes to the Church's processes on maintaining ministry standards will act to prevent the avoidance of a proper investigation into allegations of abuse and misconduct, and ensure that there is appropriate accountability for those undertaking work in the name of the Anglican Church. We have undertaken an internal investigation into the process leading to the appointment of Ross Brown as Vicar of Manurewa Parish after he left Dilworth. This report had that narrow focus, but it is not the end of this matter or other instances of abuse by clergy. The Anglican Church is planning to undertake a fuller and independent inquiry into abuse within the Church, which will include a deeper examination of the abuse by the two Dilworth chaplains. The design of this inquiry will seek survivor collaboration. Finally, a word on redress. We are aware that the school has initiated a redress program. For those who are the survivors of abuse by a school chaplain, the Church will willingly engage in a process of redress if survivors would prefer to approach the Church rather than the school. We wish to be careful that survivors do not have to engage in two different processes, and we are seeking survivor response to such an idea so that the design is appropriate. But we wish to affirm our openness to redress from the Church. The archbishops will be able to comment more on that matter and on plans for the independent inquiry, as these are being treated as a whole of church response rather than just one from the Auckland diocese. I thank commissioners for the opportunity to make these opening remarks. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Thank you very much. Can we just get the names right? Is it all right if we call you Ross?
Yes, please.
Good, thank you. And similarly for the others, I think that was our practice last time. Thank you very much.
So Ross, when were you made the Bishop of Auckland?
April 2010.
Right. And just so we can put things in context, Ross Brown left Dilworth in 2006.
Yes, in March of that year, I believe.
So before you were appointed. I would like, Felix, if you could bring up document 31, a letter that was from Aaron Snodgrass to you. 31's the last number, DSW. It's a letter that Mr. Snodgrass referred to today. No, I think it was the other letter that you just put up. 69_0031. It's the letter from Aaron Snodgrass to Bishop Ross.
This is 0031. Is this the one you wanted?
No, it's the one that you just gave me, the number 4.
Is that the one?
No. That's a reply to a letter I write in response to your letter of 17 June 2019, and that's the letter that we're wanting to put up, that was put up this morning. Yes, thank you. It's in the Dilworth bundle here. So again, just to orientate our conversation, that's the letter that was referred to today from Mr. Snodgrass to you, dated the 17th of June 2019. So Mr. Snodgrass gave evidence about the church having the full knowledge of the abuse at Dilworth. So I just wanted to narrow into this issue of what you knew as at 2019.
Could you just bring your microphone a bit closer? We're having
Yes.
trouble hearing. That's better. Thank you.
What you knew in June 2019 regarding actions, abuse, allegations involving Ross Brown, the then chaplain. And this is the letter that you received, and it records by way of summary. We discussed the historical complaints that Dilworth received from students regarding RB. We are now aware from your reports by Dr. Susan Blackwell that the actions of RB at the time they took place were not considered criminal, but following a Supreme Court decision, such actions would now constitute a criminal offence. So just in a nutshell, and let's be just using the language, that's referring to what was said to be an allegation of boys masturbating or being encouraged to masturbate in class.
Yes, they were the matters that related to Ross Brown leaving the school in 2006, and a report that was made to the Bishop of Auckland at the time about that matter, and it described those behaviours in that classroom that were about encouraging masturbation.
And then we see down the bottom of that page, he also refers to another meeting where he says that you had discussed concerns with RB, continuing to minister in Manurewa with a bishop, and that he advised that he and another person agreed that until a further complaint had been received involving criminal behaviour, that the church not remove RB from his position. Now I'd like to take you through to the reply letter that you sent, and I'll ask you about that, of the 26th of June 2019. This is Anglican 642, yes, that one there. I'll just ask if the commissioners, you may wish to bring up, I think we can do that third paragraph. You have informed me that legal advice newly received suggests that the events in question would now be regarded as criminal. What's that referring back to?
That's referring to the classroom actions that led to his removal from, or him leaving the school.
And that there are concerns about other allegations known to exist from former students. I note, however, that the school is unaware of the substance of those allegations, and that the students concerned are not intending to bring those allegations to the school. While I understand the school's view of what occurred has changed, it is not clear to me that there is at present any new evidence which would lead me to suspend or remove Mr. Brown from his post. I would be pleased to learn quickly of any new evidence. So what did you know at that stage about these other allegations known to exist from former students?
So Aaron Snodgrass approached me to tell me that he had been visited by another bishop and another person with him, that they were bringing to the school the awareness of allegations that I refer to in this letter. These are the other allegations known to exist. But at that point, no disclosure of detail about those allegations had been made to the school, just that there were matters that some old boys of the school were concerned about but did not want to approach the school itself. So there was no substance to what the matters were about, but Aaron was advising me of that.
Well, to be clear again, did you know they were sexual, of a sexual nature?
No, I didn't know anything of the detail of them. My memory is that Aaron himself was unaware of the nature of them.
And you say
I guess
there I would
made
be...
an assumption that they probably were related to the earlier matters that we did know about, but there wasn't any substance to them.
And you said I would be pleased to learn quickly of any new evidence. And we heard from Mr. Snodgrass that at some point he took a file of information to the police about allegations. Were you provided with that file?
No, I thought what he was saying this morning was that was Ross Brown's file that contained information that they took to the police, but I've not seen that file.
And on that same day, 26 June 2019, and this is Dilworth 030006, a letter dated 26 June 2019. And I'll read in, this is got a new document number. No, that's not it. In this letter that you send to...
I think rather than taking up the time, if you could just read it out, it would be helpful.
In this letter, which is of the same date, 26th of June, which you write to the Chief Executive of Oranga Tamariki and New Zealand Police, because Mr. Snodgrass had sent a letter to those two entities. Again, we see in paragraph 3, your recording, I understand that the Dilworth Trust Board now takes a different view of the original behaviour, which led to Mr. Brown's resignation. So it's this issue of whether it's criminal or not. Mr. Campbell's letter implies that it is a failure on my part not to have removed Mr. Brown from his current position. And you say, I wish to clarify I have not done so, as I do not believe there is sufficient cause for me to act in such a way under the provisions of natural justice. You stress that you are anxious to ensure that licensed ministers observe appropriate standards of behaviour towards vulnerable people, particularly children and young persons. And then again, in the final paragraph, you say to both Oranga Tamariki and the police, if either of your organisations has any information which you are able to share with me and which bears on the fitness of Reverend Brown to continue to hold office at St Luke's Church, Manurewa, then I would be pleased to receive it. And you invite a discussion if they would like. What response did you get, or what information did you get to that plea?
Nothing directly in relation to that request. I did get an acknowledgement from the New Zealand Police that they were undertaking an investigation and would contact me if they required anything from me.
Did they provide you detail of the allegations or information?
No, they didn't.
Thank you. I'd like to call up another document, TGC 40 and then 514. It's a document that was put to a witness this morning. This is a police job sheet. It's 2 pages. It's dated the 19th of February 2001. It's by a detective constable. It records that there is an allegation of possible possession of objectionable material on the part of Ross Brown. And then on the second page we see that Detective Constable makes an inquiry that same month with...
Sorry, we've had to pause the live stream evidence. We'll be back in a few minutes. Sorry, we've had to pause the live stream evidence. We'll be back in a few minutes.
I'll now turn to Don and Philip. And you can answer as you see fit and chime in or riff off each other, was it? The first topic I'd like to talk about is a systems and cultural rebuild, the fundamentals. In paragraph 70 of your joint statement to the Commission, you say, our General Synod is putting aside significant time and resources to engage in wānanga around Mataranga Māori, Mataranga Minhari, Mihi as a pathway forward for a shared future. Could you speak to that and what it involves?
Rock, scissors. We're trying to take very seriously the learnings that we've had with our experience with the Royal Commission, which has very clearly demonstrated to us that we've had significant systems failure, particularly around the protection of children and vulnerable people.
Keep your voice up.
Right. So, and part of our approach to these things, and has been for the 200 years that this whakapono has been a part of us, is to think very deeply about the set of values that we are drawing upon, that we are basing our behaviour and practice upon. And a big part of that in our history has been the mātauranga of our people. So we haven't simply just adopted a value set from overseas by way of a foreign faith. We've blended it with the mātauranga that our people developed over time in their history. And so we're using this conversation to really look at the bedrock values upon which we believe that we are built, values that we believe in instances where abuse has occurred, we have failed to live up to. And so we're having an all-of-church discussion about the values that are important to us, and particularly about how those values can be used to help nurture and protect our children and our vulnerable people and all of the people within our hahi. So we gather next week as a General Synod. It's 120 delegates from across the 5 nations of our province, including Polynesia, and we are committing ourselves to a complete redesign of the systems and the practices and the culture that we have in place around these things. And it's a journey for us. We know that it's going to take some time, but we're not afraid to hold ourselves accountable and to be held accountable in this space, and that's what this activity is all about for us.
And if I may add, one of the drivers for that has been, as we have sought to face into the challenges that have been raised by our failures in the past, particularly to support and keep safe the vulnerable. We've had to face into some deep inequities in our church, and we touched on that in our last brief of evidence. Those inequities are embedded in our structure, and they're the reflection of colonial history, of a hahi that was inherently Māori for the first decades of its existence, and as part of the process of land alienation, the church, the settler church, benefited. It benefited in terms of resource, and it benefited in terms of structure. Tahahi Mihanari Māori, who in most cases gifted the resources for the purposes of the gospel, have been significantly disadvantaged. And we've been through years of sort of positioning in our relationship with each other, which is adversarial. We've used the language of resource sharing, but actually we haven't engaged with what it means to encounter each other's ways of knowing, and as a consequence of that, start to understand each other's perspectives. So Don lives in my world, is fluent in my world. I don't live in his world, and I'm not fluent in his world, and I should be, because that's what the treaty dreamed of, and that's what our constitution as a church says should be the ideal, and this is the current reality. We believe that is foundational to the structural inequality in our society and in our church, and that is part of the context of abuse. So we want to begin with first principles.
I'm now going to turn to redress. From your personal involvement in redress and meeting survivors over the last 18 months, what are the lessons that you have learned that you would like the commissioners to know?
Kia ora, thank you. I'll begin this time. I want to firstly express my gratitude to Commission staff for, in a number of cases, facilitating an opportunity for me to engage directly with survivors. I want to acknowledge also the courage of some individual survivors who have approached me directly. Most importantly, I want to express my gratitude to those who have, against all of their experience, have trusted me into that space. I think fundamentally that has been a journey that you as survivors have taken me on. It's been a journey of trust, on your part, deep humility and grace. It's been a journey of having to restate your experience. One of the things you've taught me is that although we might use some common processes in each of those encounters, they are fundamentally different in each case. And they need to be. There is no one size fits all. I think I've learnt that when, in my case, the Archbishop of the Church, one of the Archbishops of the Church, is in the room, it changes the significance of the encounter. And I know that I am allowed to use these names, but I remember Robert Oakley and my meeting with him in his home in the foothills of the Southern Alps. And I remember at one point him saying to me, "This is the closest that I've got to look into the eyes of the man who raped me and tell him what effect that has had on my life." I have learnt that the Church needs to face into that at that very deep and personal level. Yes, we need to make sure that we have good redress systems and approaches in place. They need to be, we believe, deeply embedded for us as a church in the interaction between Te Ao Māori and gospel experience and principles. For me, each of those encounters has been a deeply spiritual engagement, because it's about the whole person, and we are, in essence, body, mind and spirit. The wairua of each of those engagements is what made the difference. I don't want to lose sight of that. I also, if I may take this opportunity to recognise that there are individuals who fall between the gaps. It's a crude way of putting it, but I want to acknowledge, with his permission, Roger Allison, who is a survivor of abuse as a result of what was happening at Dilworth. Is not a Dilworth old boy, and so seems to have no place in this process of redress. Roger's story has been made well known publicly, but as a society, and certainly as a church, we have to recognise that's all of our responsibility, because I'm sure there are more Rogers out there. And how do we collectively spot the gaps and make sure that they're responded to, so that there is the potential for healing and wholeness for those who just don't seem to fit into any institutional responsibility, including, in Roger's case, ACC.
Don, do you have anything you want to add there?
Look, just to tautoko my fellow Archbishop, it's been an incredible learning for us, and an important one because we don't have a perfect template to follow. And so we've learned to rely on our mātauranga and our values. In the case of Roger, we want to acknowledge, as someone who was deemed to be outside the parameters of other institutions, it forced us to face into the fact that somebody has to take responsibility. And it hasn't just been at our level. We put it before the senior leadership of our church, who also took compassion on the case and enabled us as church leaders to respond to that survivor with a response that we hope brings healing. But we knew if we relied on existing systems, that wouldn't happen. Equally, and I hope he doesn't mind, survivors like Neil Harding, who approached us and who we saw a week later after the hearings that we first attended, standing in a court waiving his own name suppression for the sake of justice and also for the sake of enabling others to come forward. So when you're faced with that extraordinary courage, it gives you a lot of drive to do what you can, as imperfect as it might be. So we're taking that extraordinary learning forward in terms of redress, because redress isn't just, as I said, simply about trying to make reparation to survivors. It's also about exercising accountability and responsibility and understanding that dealing with guilt is not the same as dealing with shame. That enacting justice isn't the same as finding healing. There are other dimensions that are required for that, and that these hearings will come to an end. The work of this commission will come to an end, but the work of supporting survivors won't. And so we've had to take a very open approach to make we've demanded that the church make itself vulnerable and accountable for the sake of finding a way forward and co-creating that. We've come to trust very deeply survivors that are working with us, the survivor networks that hold us to account but want to work with us to find a way forward. So it's it's been an incredible process, I've got to say, very humbling, but it also gives us a lot of hope. It's been a very life-giving one we've seen. So as I said, while there's no perfect template, while we don't have all the answers, we're confident we're heading in the right direction.
Now, one final topic before I hand you over. The Royal Commission has recommended an independent redress system and that churches stop their own redress processes once it is set up and running. What are your concerns about a single state redress process? Or in a more positive way, what will it need to effect healing?
Thank you. I'll start. Firstly, we are engaging fully with the Crown Response Unit and are very, very committed to doing that. And we said in our earlier brief of evidence that we supported a single unitary approach. But we do have some concerns. The first would be around our kind of central conviction that human beings are fundamentally spiritual beings. But we live in a society, think about the 1867 Education Act that describes the provision of education in this country. Secular is a defining characteristic, and we don't compete with that, we embrace that. But the feedback that we have from colleagues in the United Kingdom and Canada and Australia is that in the case of Australia, the federal system is inherently a transactional process of reparation, not holistic at all, and certainly not one which enhances healing or enhances the spirituality and the spiritual identity of the individual. So we would have some concerns around that, and we will bring those concerns to the fore. I mean, just in relation to the Australian provision, an organisation called Koiora, which is based in the state of Victoria, have assisted us. They were established originally as a sort of an Anglican church entity and now a separate company. But when you look at the provision of services that they offer and the way in which they approach redress, it is very driven by survivor design. And I think one of the statistics which they gave when they came to lead this seminar with us was that the federal redress system has around a 53-54% survivor approval rating, and the Koiora system has an early 90s % survivor approval rating. Now, those are extraordinary figures if they're verifiable, and that's a significant gap. So we wouldn't want to see a system established in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that led to that sort of low level of survivor approval. So as I said at the beginning, we'd want to do everything we can to contribute, but we also feel that we need to take responsibility for some design work ourselves, and I do want to acknowledge Hedda Clark, who's our commissary in the redress space, and also to acknowledge the strong critique that Hedda is bringing to us as a church, institutionally, and in terms of leadership, about our continuing failures to provide the kind of environment where an appropriate redress process could be established. So I'm certainly not pointing a finger at Australia, for example, without recognising there are three pointing back at me.
My time is up, I think, so I will hand you over and you can continue the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Guy-Kidd. Yes, Ms. Anderson. I can't help myself. Is there really an Australian institution with a Māori name?
It's an Aboriginal name.
It is K-O-I-O...
No, K-O-Y-O-O-R-A, I think, Koiora. It sounds awfully like Kia ora, but it's not. And it means mountain of light.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, katoa. I'm going to cover just a few topics with you, make sure that we leave enough time for Commissioners' questions before the session closes. But starting with a practical example that you've raised that calls into play the relationship of the church with Dilworth School, and you've referred to Mr. Roger Allison, and the fact that he's had a response that he's outside the scope of the Dilworth redress process. And my understanding is that that's really, the message that he's received very clearly is that what's happened to him is, first of all, he was never a student of the school, but although the abuse occurred in facilities owned by the school, it was considered to be in the relevant staff members' private time in their private space, and so therefore there's not a basis for any vicarious liability, as I think is the language that he's may have discussed with you, that's the response he's had in relation to the redress process. Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding, yeah. And that's a response to a recent approach to the new redress framework that's been put in place, and that the response has been that was out of scope.
And so I'm interested in the fact that you've taken some, as you said, responsibility for ensuring that he hasn't fallen completely through the gaps, and that you've provided some support to him. Are you able to just help the Commissioners understand what sorts of things have you been doing in your engagement with Roger?
I'm trusting that I have his permission to speak, and I've been given an indication that I do.
And I can confirm that we've also confirmed through other mechanisms. Yes.
Okay, thank you. First and foremost, it was about establishing a relationship. Someone provided a kind of mechanism for him to contact me, and I think one of the important things is about maintaining those relationships. When people reach out in that kind of way with that level of vulnerability, to not be faithful to that relationship is I think probably the worst thing that could happen. It became clear as I came to understand Roger's experience, what had happened to him, as I engaged with people who have supported him for a lot longer than I've been involved, that there were immediate needs, and we were able to respond to some of those immediate needs. But it also became increasingly clear that there could be no kind of healing for Roger. And remember, Roger, laid a complaint with the police. He faced the trial situation of his abuser and was contributing to the conviction of his abuser. The consequence of re-entering into that reality saw his life fall apart in so many ways. You know, this is a competent, intelligent man with great skill, unable to engage in work or a normal kind of living arrangement. It became really clear that a kind of piecemeal approach, a kind of band-aid approach wasn't going to get us anywhere. His support people had been strong in their advocacy, so they had sought to raise matters with ACC, for example, because ACC had a technical reason why he didn't qualify. Certainly engagement with Dilworth, my personal engagement with Dilworth, said that it was beyond their trust deed, that he was outside of scope, basically. So
in light of that outside of scope,
yep.
you've adopted a relationship-based approach with him. So is it fair, because what we've heard partly through the engagement with the Methodist Church earlier this week is perhaps shifting away from the strict legal structures of the church and
Correct.
and going to a sort of human-centred response. And it seems to me that that's what's happened here. You haven't turned your mind to, do we really have a legal obligation as a church, given our relationship to Dilworth? You haven't come at it at all from that lens, have you?
No, we offered him a full redress process. I was honest, I hope, with him in saying that I couldn't guarantee that I'd be able to find the resources to address whatever the independent redress process might offer. But as Archbishop Don said, that commitment has been made by the church, and we will fulfil that commitment. But we hope that Roger's story, which is the story of others, will drive some change in other places, and that maybe there are others who will feel that they can contribute to Roger's well-being.
And so would you say that's an example of, I think the language that was used was facing in at the deep and personal level with somebody that's come forward reporting harm?
Correct.
So just shifting back a little bit to the relationship between the church and Dilworth, and Ross, you've outlined some aspects relating to that. Am I right that in about, might be around 2019, I'm not quite sure of the actual date, and I'm hoping not to take the time to go to the document, but that you were looking at formalising in a memorandum of understanding the relationship between yourself as bishop and Dilworth. And I wondered whether, so one of the aspects in this draft memorandum is that it's got a provision where, in addition to the visitation element and the appointment of the chaplain involvement, and that there's an agreement that the board and the bishop will update each other and or consult on significant news or developments impacting Dilworth School and the Anglican Diocese of Auckland or the Anglican Church of Aotearoa. The parties will work on a no surprises basis. Can you just give us a bit of background as to why you were looking at crystallising that in a memorandum of understanding, and has that actually ever been finally signed and formalised?
Yes, thank you. It's a matter I raised with the Trust Board last year, 2021, following my visit to the school. And in the light of the learnings from this commission, we recognised that there wasn't any contemporary definition about what the relationship really looked like. We had these two clauses from James Dilworth's will from 120 years or something ago, Episcopal visitor, brought up in the tenets of the Anglican faith. But what does it actually mean today in the running of the school? Very different place 100 years on. So that's the background as to why I brought the suggestion that we might form a memorandum of understanding that defined that clearly for us, so we understood the nature of our relationship. And then particularly when there were changes in personnel, when there's a new bishop, when there's a new head, when board trustees change, that we've got something documented to guide that ongoing
Right.
relationship.
And as you say, that's an example of this further commitment to better communication.
Yes, and the status of the document is that we've done a couple of revisions of it. I think you're probably looking at the current draft. I've had a verbal response from Mr. Snodgrass to say they're comfortable with it. We haven't yet formally signed it, and I'm making my annual visit to the board in a couple of weeks' time, and I'm anticipating that then we might be able to formalise it by signing it.
But often with these things, even while you're working with drafts, it changes behaviour, doesn't it? It can lead to that no surprises and better communication.
Yes.
Has there been a change, do you think, over the last year or so about that communication between you and the board, about what's the important things that are going on at the school?
Well, I can point to one matter in particular, and that is that the school has had an indication from their current chaplain that he's going to conclude at the end of this year. And so we do have to now face the appointment of a new chaplain, which I've raised in evidence has been a difficulty in the past. And so already the principal of the school has been in touch with me to discuss a process based on that in the memorandum of understanding, so that we're working collaboratively about coming to a decision on who the new chaplain should be. So I've noticed that immediate change.
Right. But in terms of the other significant things that are going on at the school in relation to abuse claims coming forward, what's the extent of information you currently receive about that, and including about the intention to launch the redress program, the terms of reference, etc.?
No, there hasn't been any significant exchange of information about that. Mr. Snodgrass has verbally and formally kept me abreast of some of those developments, but largely we have learnt of them through communication through our legal teams as the process has been worked up. As a church, the archbishops might be able to respond more on this. We have made submissions to the Dilworth Trust Board through their lawyers about our own views on the process and its development as they were seeking to refine it. So,
Are you talking
in that
about
way,
the process of developing the redress
developing
program?
the redress program, yes, that's correct.
And you commented on the content of that redress program?
Yes. So as it was being developed, we offered some input on the draft about matters that we thought could be different.
Well, perhaps invite the archbishops, if they do have recollection of the sorts of issues that you raised in relation to the redress program.
So we through our legal team contributed at the request to consultation, both in terms of the inquiry and in terms of the redress scheme. I think the first point we would want to make is that consultation is not co-design. Secondly, we had some concerns around the boy-on-boy abuse and the limitations around that. We had concerns about the cap as a matter of principle rather than any particular figure. So if redress is...
Is that concern on cap, what drove that concern about actually putting a number on the top number on what could be awarded?
Our experience, limited as it is that redress is about a relationship fundamentally, not a transaction. And that as soon as you put a number, even if it's a significant number, you change the nature of what you're inviting someone to trust you with. So it was on that basis that we raised that concern, not about a particular number, just about the principle of a cap. Yep. There were several other matters as well, which...
And in the end, do you think it's fair to say that the redress program that Dilworth has now operationalised, it's in its early days, really has that transactional element that somebody comes in the door, goes through a process and goes out the door with a sum of money. There's no ongoing support for that person over the future years?
I think the two comments I would make. One is that
Sorry, we've had to pause the live stream evidence. We'll be back in a few minutes. Sorry, we've had to pause the live stream evidence. We'll be back in a few minutes.
It's available for all, and that requires significant investment both in design and in resourcing.
Thank you. And coming back to you, Ross, in relation to you coming up for your current Episcopal visit and following up with a report, but when I'm looking at the 2019 report that you provided, I can bring it up if you need refreshing memory, but it's simply the point that a large section of that report is under the heading Wellbeing in the School, and quite a significant portion of your report is focused on your observations and some questions around the wellbeing. So that seemed to me to be a new departure in terms of the visitation focus. And so if you're happy to speak to you know, you seem to have embraced the role that as bishop, you could have that effectively monitoring role in relation to the well-being of the students at the school. Can you just outline your, you know,
Certainly.
why you went down that track and what benefit you think it's been providing to the school?
So I think as a result of what began to happen in 2018, I think it was, when those new matters were brought to the school as, you know, these sort of unknown substance, but these allegations. And I think the evidence we've heard this morning about the growing awareness on the board when Aaron became the chair, that they needed to do more, it was agreed with me, so it was a mutual decision that my visit in that year might offer some focus on wellbeing and safety. I think partly so that the school was able to demonstrate to me the sort of steps that they were taking to ensure safety and well-being, and also to allow me to offer any comment on them if I wished to. So it was a particular focus of that year and that report, hence why the report's largely about that. But I think it does form an ongoing aspect of, while I'm in the school for that visit, the sort of things that I might discuss and look at with others on the staff, and then in my discussions with the board. I think in the Memorandum of Understanding, we note that we would undertake at least annually to report to one another on any matters that we're aware of. I think it should happen at any time during the year, but I think my official visit to the trustees is an opportunity to actually say and record, are there any matters that we need to advise one another about?
And so broadening that out and to the three of you, I'm not sure who might want to come in first, to the question of, with the other Anglican schools that would probably more accurately or would own the title Anglican school a little bit more perhaps than Dilworth does, although it has a close relationship with the church. So for those other Anglican schools, what sort of role is developing for the church in terms of ensuring the well-being of the students at those schools? Is there any activity in that space since we spoke with you in March 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, again, speaking to the work we're doing in terms of an all-of-church wānanga about what our value set is around these things. And then being able to clearly articulate back into those school relationships what it means to be mihinare in these islands, what the whakapapa of that identity is, the taonga that have been handed down from generation to generation because of that identity, and therefore what we're obligated morally and ethically and spiritually to be. And in some cases, in relationship to some of the schools, those things have been lost a little bit, have ceased to be articulated. The stories haven't been told. We haven't reminded ourselves of the values that we believe in, that we want to see upheld. Things that are life-giving, and the idea that, you know, the presence of abuse in any form is a complete failure of who we say we are and who, what we want to live up to. So it sparked a huge, I think, activity amongst some of our school relationships, and, you know, to the point where we're having a complete redesign of the value frameworks that we're having. For instance, in Te Hokorere, other places in the Polynesian School Network, we're talking about a value set such as orangake, the idea of that the entire purpose of our faith is to enable people to flourish, and the presence of abuse is a complete antithesis of that. And so we're learning, again, how to make that more than just talk, how to really embed it into the practice of our schools so that it becomes a dependable and enduring trait of what these schools offer to children.
And does that move into also the space of whether the schools are responding adequately to reports of abuse that have come to the school, and that the redress that they're offering is in that, not in that transactional adversarial space? What's happening in that area?
Yeah, you know, it's a conversation that has a lot of layers to it. You know, for instance, we have private schools, and so, you know, you're really dependent upon the relationship with the board in those cases as to how deeply embedded you can make those conversations. You have integrated schools where, you know, we as a church might own, in quote marks, you know, the land and the hostel program particularly, but we don't employ the principal or any of the teachers. We have limited authority in what goes on in the classroom. So it's utterly dependent on the quality of our relationships, and all that means is we just have to work harder to build trust, and to keep advocating for the same values, that we make sure that we're all adhering to it.
Does it seem that if somebody's really unable to get an adequate response from an Anglican school, in terms of abuse that happened in the school, that, like with Roger, that there's they should think that they can come to the church and have a conversation with the church about redress for them in that relationship sense that you've talked about? Is that something that you're contemplating or encouraging? What's happening there?
Something that we're doing. We, you know, because, again, there's no perfect template, and often, you know, there's a lot of failure points in the conversation, in the system. We're trying to adopt, at least from an all-of-church perspective, that we need to step up and take responsibility regardless, as much as possible. And, you know, in the hope that down the line in the conversation, schools and other institutions that we have would also adopt the same stance, because ultimately you're talking about human beings that have incredible sacred worth. It's not fair that we create systems and structures that exclude them from healing. So, you know, the conversation we're trying to lay over the top of that is to say, look, there's a moral and spiritual dimension to this within which we must remain responsible and accountable. And it has to be led by compassion and care. So, you know, that's the space we're in at the moment, isn't it? I mean, when we talk about legal frameworks, Crown-led initiatives, at some point you end up with parameters that have some people inside and some people outside. And to be honest, the call of the church is to kind of go and sit in those margins and stand with those that have been excluded until they're excluded no more.
So using an example, again, we've got the survivor's permission for this, Mrs. N, that you'll recall from the school in Christchurch, that I think Bishop Carroll discussed in the previous hearing, and in the state institutional response hearing, her evidence was again raised. I'm not sure whether you followed that, about her interactions with the teaching council. You might recall there was an issue about her having to push for reporting of the abuse to the teaching council, and then the impact of that teaching council experience on her. So for somebody in her position, if a person like that is having difficulty getting a redress outcome from the school, is she the kind of person that you say might be falling through the gaps and can come through a door to the church to have a conversation? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, we're ready to support. We can't guarantee successful advocacy and other structures over which we have no authority or can't compel. But we certainly believe that it's our duty to stand and support, no matter what.
You don't draw a legal distinction that it's the school's responsibility. We don't have to have a conversation about that. You take a different approach.
Yeah, trying to.
But I think it's fair to say that that has to be led from the leadership, because it is a culture change, and we've expressed the aspiration and the commitment, but I think we're a long way from reflecting that in our institutional responses. It's a work in progress, but that's the commitment.
And I'll just raise with you now, and I'm not expecting a response from you, but you might recall that Bishop Carroll in the previous hearing indicated that he would work on an approach and acknowledgement to Mrs N. And we understand that hasn't happened as yet, so I raise that with you as something for the importance of follow-through in terms of commitments that are made to survivors, which I'm sure is a point that you well understand. In terms of, I think you've been very clear that not that much has happened in a formal sense with redress program within the church. You've focused on the Title D, and you've been very focused on direct contact with relevant survivors. So there's not a systems approach, but there is the underpinning core value that you've articulated. It's not transactional, it's relationship, and that's the basis on which you're proceeding in the interim until there's a resolution of what an overall independent system might look like. Is that right? Is that a fair characterisation?
Yes, but I think in addition we would say that the commitment to Hedda Clark's role is a starting point. As I said, Hedda's initial feedback to us is there's a whole lot in our own house that we need to get in order, and that if we're really going to take this seriously, then we need to put significant resourcing around it. So simply the appointment of a skilled practitioner with years of experience doesn't a summer make.
In terms of the, Ross, you mentioned that there's going to be an independent inquiry relating to the two chaplains at Dilworth. Can you tell us a little bit more about when that might be up and running? Because that's a development that wasn't mentioned in your evidence, so this is something relatively new, is it?
Yes. I'll make a brief comment, and then again the Archbishops, because it's a whole of church response, would be best to comment further, and they'll be the ones responsible for working with the Standing Committee of our General Synod to implement this. But it's come about as we've thought more and more about the abuse undertaken by Ross Brown and the other former chaplain at Dilworth School, the fact that we don't fully understand everything that went on, and that it's important we find out and what the learnings are, and an awareness of the fact that there are a number of other instances of abuse by clergy across the church where we need to find out and understand more about that. And so in our conversations together, we've come to the view that an independent inquiry into abuse within the Anglican Church as a whole is important, and it would include both those chaplains. But perhaps Archbishop Philip might like to say more.
Oh, so much broader than just the two chaplains at
It will include those two, but we feel it's important that it's broader.
We believe there are at least 8 to 10 cases where, among other things, the question of what bishops did or didn't know, what bishops did or didn't do, of critical centrality to the ongoing abuse that vulnerable young people experienced. So it's not an adequate response to simply identify that. We think that there are deeper and broader questions that need to be asked. And I just want to acknowledge Ross in encouraging us to look at this broader and deeper inquiry across a wider range. Ross was acknowledging that his own decisions are inevitably, as are mine, as are Archbishop Don's, going to be subject to that. So it's current as well as historical. It's to ensure that even things like our safe to receive processes are much, much, much more robust by making sure we've analysed the past, making sure our record keeping, trying to get to the point where we have a fully centralised file keeping system for the whole church, accessible to those who need to have access, so that we don't have bonfires in the backyard of the bishop's house on the day before retirement, which has happened.
Yes.
If I might add too, I think it may be that we end up with a series of inquiries, successive inquiries, as we keep going back over the ground to make sure that we are kind of exposing everything to the light and learning properly. Because at some point we do want to get to the stage where we're more proactive in this space, particularly in terms of the identification, discernment, training of ministers, office holders. Because we need a brand new tool set. One of our learnings here is that, how do you identify risk? How do you mitigate it? How do you eliminate it in terms of creating a safe space for people? And, we're kind of hopeful that this, form of accountability through a mechanism like inquiry and a re-interrogation of our past decisions might help us build new systems that won't fail us in the same way.
Because you certainly already have, in terms of what happened, for example, the first chaplain at Dilworth, there's clear evidence, isn't there, of reports of abuse prior to the agreement and whatever the certification process was within the church to move him to Dilworth.
Yeah, it appears to be non-existent at the time, doesn't it?
Sorry?
It appeared to be non-existent at the time in terms of expectation of disclosure from one bishop to another or from one bishop to an institution in that case.
That's right, yeah. But so there was knowledge but no communication of that information.
That's what the evidence suggests.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of the report, Ross, that you commissioned into the decision-making in relation to Ross Brown, what's the relationship of that document to the inquiry that you're talking about? Would that be an input into that broader inquiry?
I would expect so, yes. As I said, that report, we commissioned it, we wanted some answers about some particular things as quickly as we could. So it had a very narrow focus, in particular with the needs of the significant stakeholder, if you like, in that process was the parish of Manurewa, who ended up with Ross Brown as their vicar. They certainly wanted to know about how that had come about and what we had known. So it really had that narrow focus. But I think that would be a piece of information that would obviously then be fed into a wider inquiry.
And there's a reference, and I'm not going to go through that report in detail with you now because I do want to give commissioners time for questions. There's a comment in there, Ross, that when you've come in as bishop in 2010, you've inherited some decisions that have already been made by the previous bishop about issuing a fitness to minister. Probably not quite right, the language that I've got there, but and you didn't feel that you could revisit that decision. So just talk to me about that dynamic of a bishop inheriting decisions and what barriers there are to actually taking a fresh look at a particular moment in time.
I mean, I have found this really tricky, I'll be honest. I've been guided in my mind and on the advice of others on this matter by issues of fairness. And if I was going to critique myself, I would say, did I put too much emphasis on fairness of process? My view was that my predecessor had received information about the reasons why Ross Brown left Dulwich School, had taken actions cognizant of that, had determined that he could continue in ministry, and had allowed an appointment. And I felt that I was now inheriting the office of bishop. There's a sense in which, you know, you inherit the decisions of your predecessors and have to stand with them. So I didn't feel that in terms of fairness of process that I felt able to revisit that and determine otherwise. I accept that I could have, you know, perhaps taken a different view, but that's the view that I took.
And in terms of the recalibration that's been talked about going on, that would be one of the aspects, won't it, that will inevitably be part of that conversation?
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the great benefits that I see in our revised ministry standards work is that a bishop now would have no choice, would be required to take the information that had come to them from Dulwich School about the nature of his resignation and to pass it to the Ministry Standards Commission to have that assessed and looked at. So it's now unavoidable that a bishop, you know, could just say, gosh, I think in this situation this seems the right thing to do. And I think that's a really critical safeguard for us, and particularly for us as bishops.
I don't have any further questions for you. Madam Chair, shall I hand over to Commissioners? I'm not sure whether you want to take a break before you go into questioning or whether you want to just move
I think we
straight
should just box on and then take a very short break. I'm very mindful we've got a lot of people waiting to address us in closing submissions, so let's use every valuable moment we can. I think we will, the Commissioners will also commit to keeping their questions as short as possible, always with the understanding that we could come back to you, Bishops 03, if we needed to. Is that all right? All right. Paul, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a quick question, learning, you might have expressed it, but there's a lot of, when reviewing these things, focus on procedural fairness, getting that legal advice correct and almost protecting the institution. I'm not sort of hearing the balance in the past of protecting victims and potential victims, the balanced voice. Is there advice on impact on people potentially affected by those with allegations against them? Is that a learning, what's going to happen going forward in terms of how you run the next inquiry?
I'll have a go to begin with. So I think that's an accurate description of the way things have been, and I think part of the recalibration of culture that we're describing is about shifting where the starting point is and who you listen to. So when we talk about establishing an inquiry, for example, into those 8 to 10 examples of where bishops have clearly made decisions that around which there are significant questions, we would like that inquiry to be co-designed with survivors that we're working with. So I think some of that shift is in the practice that we initiate, which is a sort of advantage, I guess, at the moment of what bluntly might be called the kind of ad hoc approach that we're taking, or case-by-case approach we're taking to redress.
Could I ask if there's any thinking beyond co-design to actually have survivors as inquirers?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely viable. I can think of a situation in my own diocese where our significant resource person in terms of process leading is a survivor.
Okay, thank you.
Talofa lava, I'll keep it brief. Very encouraged in hearing about the inquiry that you're intending to undertake, because it's really looking at yourselves as to what constitutes a healthy Anglican church. What does that look like? My question really relates to the issue of social change that I think you've been talking about this afternoon, and because churches are made up of volunteers, they're just your average, everyday person who wants to go along to a particular parish and whatnot. And I'm really interested in your perception and perhaps the reality check of your reach into your parishioners in all of the different, in your different tikanga, and how you're really going to be able to stimulate that conversation. So it's great to talk about it at a conceptual, structural level, but actually that change is really driven from the people who belong to the faith, yeah. And to the parents who belong in the schools who aren't always Anglican, like at Dilworth.
Yeah. Look, we're under no illusions as to the size of the task. So we're trying to approach it on multiple levels. I mean, certainly trying to embody that change is a very important thing to us. And we've taken on that challenge to try to example in every way possible what this would look like. We're also, like I said, redirecting the focus of some of our most significant governance bodies into that conversation, to take ownership of the conversation and to make commitments to even legislate in some ways that this is the new way forward. We're also organising a series of regional wānanga events that will kind of disseminate the conversation as much as possible. We're investing into new comms networks that will turn it into a very regular, will hold the story in front of us. We're seeking to embed it into the curricula of our schools network, and we're working with the schools that are willing and ready to go to embody that conversation as well. So, from the standpoint of our roles and where we're positioned in the structure, we're searching for every avenue possible to create that culture change, that social change. And it's kind of a two-pronged approach, as I said. I mean, we have to accept that there's a long pathway to it. It'll take a long time it's almost generational change in some ways. But there's also a number of things that we can do now, and the most powerful thing to do is to be practitioners in the first sense. So that's kind of where it's at for us at the moment.
One of the huge opportunities we've got, which is not completely unique to our organisation, but it is part of who we are, is that every Sunday I'm in a different small community around Waikato Taranaki. So I'm connecting with local communities, and I've known those communities for 22 years as bishop. I've known those people across now, 2 generations. So we have the ability to influence. We talked about that last time. That is a real possibility. We know community leaders. We relate to health services. We are providers of social services and schools, obviously. So we have networks of influence that we can either sort of go, well, just leave them to it, or use every opportunity we've got. And I think the moral imperative on every bishop and every regional leader, we have a structure of archdeacons and regional leaders that work with those influences, and we can affect change effectively over time, and maybe less time than we fear.
Thank you. Andrew?
Tēnā koutou. It's encouraging to hear about all the mahi that's been done, and to address the structural inequalities, as you put it, and it's been long-standing and deeply embedded, and as we've been hearing, will take a lot of hard work in order to take that vision, put it into effect, and it could be generational. But it is encouraging just to hear about the work that's been done since we saw you last. So I wish you all the best with the mahi ahead. On the comment on the discussion about redress, we too had concerns about the national redress scheme in Australia. We had the benefit of reviewing their 2-year review, and we were aware of the criticisms that it had, along with many other redress schemes around the world. But when I listen to your concerns, Mr. Richardson, I don't really think we're poles. I think the concerns that you expressed were actually concerns that we noted in our report too, about the need for a holistic approach and ensuring that it's survivor-led in particular. It's not the last word from us on the kaupapa of redress. There'll be more for us to say, but really the foundations are in that report. So there are no questions from me. I just wanted to pass on those comments. And yes, thank you. Thank you for returning. Thank you for your time today. Yeah.
Thank you. And we would want to reiterate our commitment to that work at the national redress level. I think the best way of us collectively as a community achieving the very best outcome in that space is to contribute. So we'll keep bringing our concern, but we certainly appreciated the position that the Commission took in the report.
Okay. Kia ora. Kia
ora. Kia ora koutou. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to confine it just to one. And listening to you, I'm reflecting on what feels like a very profound sea change from the evidence that we received from you in 2020 in relation to particularly the assumption of leadership, reassumption, the reaffirmment of the leadership of the archbishops. I noted that you are using words where we have demanded that this will happen. I felt before there was a reticence, maybe, bishops hold their own domain and their own diocese, etc. And this feels like a widening, not becoming hierarchical, but just imposing the values and standards that we know that you embody. So that's interesting. And with that, you've used the word a lot of accountability. And I think that's something that on our journey through this evidence over the last week or so, the word accountability has been used a lot, interpreted differently a lot, and we have run the gamut from strict legal accountability to a much wider embracing of accountability in not just the legal sense, but the moral, the ethical, the spiritual sense. And I feel that I want you to know that I see that and I acknowledge it. In that ground, and it's a big hint really, not to you but to others out there in the churches listening, to what extent is there a conversation between the churches about this? Because it seems to me we have a range of views across our various churches that we have heard from, and no doubt others from whom we have not heard. Is there an interfaith, I know there's an interfaith type institution, but has this issue come up, or is it likely to come up?
A couple of things, Madam Chair. Firstly, I'd say our ability to demand anything remains pretty poor. But, the exercise of leadership for us has been the exercise of servanthood and doing the work and earning the opportunity. In terms of your question, I don't think nearly enough has been done in the ecumenical space, the interchurch space. There are some initial reasons for that, with different polity, different structures, different authorities. But if we use that as an excuse, we're really framing the conversation in the wrong space. If we framed it in the sense of relationship, that's where true accountability lies, because we are obliged to manaki each other, to love one another. Where I have seen it begin in a very encouraging way has really been amongst our theological education providers. So there's a growing desire for more collaboration and working out these relationships and these conversations together. And I think that's pretty important because those are the entities that train our future leaders.
Yeah.
So that's been the most encouraging thing. I think the most discouraging thing is that there's been a lack of collaboration amongst existing leaders. That would be
Yes.
fair to say. I think the desire's there, but we are yet to really activate that.
Well, I think we've seen that, and I take some small credit for the not as individuals, but the existence of the Royal Commission, I think, has focused everybody to the issues, and I share your observation. It's not about the legal structures, it's not about what system that church has but what position you take in relation to survivors of abuse.
Madam Chair, if I could just add
Certainly.
to Archbishop Don. Last month, on behalf of the Archbishops, because of their absence, I attended the National Church Leaders meeting, which does bring together some church leaders from across denominations. And safety was one of the topics at that meeting. And it was good to be able to share on behalf of the Anglican. I was invited to do so on behalf of what some of our experiences have been. And good to see that there is a conversation being initiated between the churches at that level about what we can learn from one another and the importance of carrying that forward. So I think there is some beginning on that.
Oh, it's good to hear and encouraging.
And if I could just add, because there's got to be three voices.
Of course there have, yes.
Just to finish. I mean, in Aotearoa now and going forward, there's also an interfaith conversation. And again, we have a platform for that, and therefore we've got an obligation for that. So the interfaith conversations, which are often about, how do we live together in mutual respect across faiths that could be seen to be oppositional or, seeking to proselytise over and against each other. What are the opportunities to demonstrate a different kind of way of co-living? And we're better placed to begin than, the safety of the most vulnerable in our communities.
Exactly. That's a fine note to end, the safety of the most vulnerable in our communities. Thank you for having that final word. Thank you very much indeed. Final thanks to the Anglican Church, like to all the others and faith-based institutions who have cooperated so willingly with it. Well, you mightn't have been willing, but you have cooperated and so fulsomely with us for all the work you've done coming along today again, and for, I'm sure, further demands on your time that we make of you. We thank you very sincerely indeed for that. So here endeth the lesson, if I might just steal a phrase.
Thanks be to God.